A rare and fiery moment that's caught the attention of both political analysts and everyday viewers. In an unexpected twist, Burkina Faso's young and controversial leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore, aired his raw and unfiltered opinions on live television. And his remarks were anything but diplomatic. What's more, they were directly aimed at none other than former U.S. President Donald Trump. Let's break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and why Trump, usually never one to back down from a fight, is showing signs of unease. The incident unfolded during a nationally televised panel discussion in Burkina Faso. The event, meant to highlight African sovereignty, anti-colonial sentiment, and the challenges faced by the Sahel region, quickly turned into something much more charged. Captain Traore, who has risen to power with a fiery stance against foreign interference, suddenly shifted focus from France, a frequent target of his critiques, to the United States, and specifically to Trump. With millions watching across Francophone Africa, Traore did not mince words. He accused Trump of being the face of Western hypocrisy, someone who, in Traore's words, pretends to champion nationalism and freedom, but only when it serves Western power. He continued, "How dare a man speak of making his country great again while mocking the struggles of nations that have been looted for generations?" The room fell silent. It wasn't just the statement. It was the conviction, the anger, and the precision with which he delivered it. This wasn't a rehearsed political jab. This was raw. Traore went further, referencing Trump's past remarks on African nations, calling them disrespectful and rooted in colonial arrogance. He claimed Trump had no moral ground to speak on issues of sovereignty when he represents the very empire that has destabilized continents for profit. Now, let's take a moment here. It's rare, extremely rare, for a sitting or interim leader of a small African country to call out a figure like Trump in such direct terms, and even rarer to do so on live television. But Traore has never followed the usual script. Since taking power in 2022, he's rebranded himself as a voice of defiance in a region long controlled by outside interests, be it France, the US, or multinational corporations. This moment only solidifies his growing reputation as a revolutionary figure for a new independent Africa. So how did Trump respond? Interestingly, he didn't respond with one of his usual bold tweets or Truth Social rants. Instead, sources close to the Trump camp said there was a noticeable shift in tone behind closed doors. Advisors reportedly urged him not to escalate the situation, concerned that Traore's popularity among anti-colonial movements in Africa could trigger broader backlash if Trump retaliated too harshly. And there's another layer here: geopolitics. With the U.S. quietly increasing military partnerships and influence in West Africa under the radar, Traore's words could jeopardize certain intelligence operations or resource agreements. According to leaked diplomatic cables, Washington has already classified the situation in Burkina Faso as volatile with unpredictable leadership. The last thing the U.S. wants is for a regional figure to stir anti-American sentiment, especially one with rising popularity among the youth and military figures across the continent. But for Trump, this hit a nerve. Sources say he felt blindsided. He's used to criticism from traditional rivals, Democrats, media, activists. But Traore represents something different. A young African leader accusing him on global TV of being a symbol of imperial oppression? That doesn't sit well with the image Trump has tried to build, a global nationalist icon. Let's also talk briefly about public reaction. In African social media, the clip of Traore's speech exploded. Hashtags like Traore speaks truth and African pride began trending. In Burkina Faso and neighboring countries, crowds gathered in support, chanting anti-imperialist slogans and praising Traore's boldness. Some even called him the Thomas Sankara of our time, referencing the revolutionary Burkinabe leader assassinated in 1987. Meanwhile, in the U.S., responses have been mixed. Some conservatives dismissed Traore's remarks as the rant of an ungrateful strongman, while others in progressive circles acknowledged the historical pain behind his words. A few political commentators, however, pointed out the irony. A man like Trump, who often positions himself as the fighter against global elites, being cast as a face of the very system he claims to battle. In essence, this wasn't just an outburst. It was a symbolic moment, a head-on collision between two vastly different visions of power, sovereignty, and truth. One from the heart of West Africa, shaped by decades of exploitation and struggle. The other from the halls of Western politics, shaped by privilege, populism, and media dominance. So what happens next? For Traore, this could elevate his status further, or isolate him even more diplomatically. For Trump, it's an uncomfortable reminder that the world is changing, and that the voices once silenced are now speaking, loudly, confidently, and unapologetically. Whether you agree with Traore or not, one thing is clear. The global political landscape is shifting. Power dynamics are being questioned, and leaders like Traore are willing to put their careers on the line to challenge what they see as systemic injustice. Trump, for all his bravado, may have just met a different kind of adversary, not one with nuclear codes, but one with the voice of a continent rising. While the world was still buzzing from Ibrahim Traore's fiery remarks, another headline emerged, this time from neighboring Mali, where Assimi Goïta, the transitional president, and a close ally of Traore, made an unannounced appearance at a regional security summit in Bamako. What followed was a bold, defiant message that once again rattled Western officials. Goïta accused NATO countries of engineering chaos in the Sahel to justify their military presence, and called for the immediate removal of all foreign forces from West African soil. Now, this wasn't just political grandstanding. This was a coordinated message, an echo of the same anti-imperialist rhetoric Traore had delivered days earlier. Goïta's tone was calm, deliberate, but unmistakably firm. He pointed fingers at specific operations carried out by the US and France, suggesting that so-called counterterrorism missions were, in fact, resource control mechanisms disguised as humanitarian intervention. He said, quote, "The enemies of African peace do not come from the deserts of Timbuktu. They arrive in suits with contracts, air bases, and empty promises." And that line alone sent diplomatic shockwaves through embassies from Washington to Paris. In a matter of days, two West African leaders, young, military-trained, and unapologetically anti-Western, had issued open challenges to the global order. And behind the scenes, analysts are now openly talking about a new bloc forming, a pan-Africanist military axis stretching from Burkina Faso to Mali to Niger, rejecting Western influence in favor of homegrown leadership, security, and alliances, especially with countries like Russia, China, and even Iran. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Just 24 hours after Goïta's speech, French officials announced the closure of another military base in Mali. U.S. defense officials, when asked about the accusations, gave vague responses, some denying involvement, others saying the claims were under review. But what's telling is that no official rebuttal has come from the top. Neither Biden nor Macron has directly responded to Goïta or Traore. Why? Because this isn't just politics, this is a deepening fracture. What we're seeing is the rise of a new breed of African leadership, militant, outspoken, and radically independent. These aren't presidents in business suits managing donor relationships. These are battle-hardened officers who believe their nations have nothing left to lose, and they're willing to challenge global power structures head-on. Meanwhile, there are whispers of something bigger. A leaked communiqué from the ECOWAS intelligence unit, not yet confirmed but widely circulated, suggests that Traore and Goïta are planning to announce a new defense coalition before the end of the year, a sort of Sahel Shield, the EI objective, to create a joint command center to monitor foreign troops, coordinate counterterrorism efforts without NATO input, and even expel remaining Western contractors from resource zones. And guess what? Trump's name came up again. Apparently, Goïta made a subtle jab at Trump during a post-speech interview, saying, "At least Biden hides behind diplomacy. Trump just put a price tag on Africa and called it policy." Once again, the American former president is being dragged into a firestorm of anti-colonial rhetoric, not because he's currently in power, but because of the legacy his administration left in the region, particularly after cutting aid programs and dismissing African nations in blunt terms. So what we're witnessing is more than political posturing. This is the early phase of a geopolitical reorientation. The Sahel, long overlooked or treated as a chessboard by global powers, is now fighting to reclaim its agency, loudly, defiantly, and unapologetically. For now, all eyes are on Traore, Goita, and a region that's fed up with broken promises. Stay tuned. This is just the beginning of a story that could reshape the balance of power in Africa and far beyond. Just days after Ibrahim Traore and Assimi Goita's explosive anti-Western statements, a third shockwave hit, this time from Niger. General Abdourahmane Chiani, the military leader who seized power in a coup last year, took to the stage during a national broadcast and issued a stern, unprecedented warning to the United Nations and the European Union. His words: "Africa will no longer be a testing ground for your diplomacy or your drones." The statement was bold, direct, and echoed a rising sentiment across the region. Africa is done playing defense. Chiani accused international institutions of weaponizing aid, using counterterrorism as a mask for surveillance, and ignoring African sovereignty in the name of development. What caught most observers off guard, though, was how specific he got. He directly named the EU's EUMPM military mission in Niger, claiming it was functionally identical to a colonial occupation, with new branding. He even went so far as to threaten the declassification of what he called hundreds of hours of confidential footage and recordings, allegedly proving that Western military advisors were involved in unauthorized extraction of rare earth minerals from Niger's northern territories. If true, this would explode into one of the biggest international scandals in years. Now here's where things get really serious. In response to Chiani's remarks, EU diplomats in Niamey reportedly went into emergency lockdown mode. Multiple embassies confirmed that contingency plans for rapid staff withdrawal were reactivated, the same ones used during the 2023 coup. Meanwhile, the United Nations issued a brief statement urging calm and constructive dialogue, but stopped short of denying any of the allegations. And while the West scrambles to manage the fallout, Niger's alliance with its neighbors continues to deepen. Following the speech, Chiani had a private call with both Traore and Goita, and according to insiders, all three leaders agreed to form a resource defense pact that would ban foreign companies from mining in their countries unless new terms were negotiated and approved publicly. This is unheard of. For decades, Africa's wealth in minerals, gold, uranium, cobalt, lithium, has been harvested under agreements negotiated behind closed doors, often in the favor of Western or Chinese firms. If these three military leaders actually follow through and publish those contracts or revoke them outright, we could see global markets shaken, particularly in sectors like tech, energy, and defense, all of which rely on those African resources. But here's the kicker. Chiani didn't stop with just institutions. He also took a swipe at Elon Musk. Yes, Elon Musk. During the same televised address, Chiani called out Musk's satellite internet project Starlink, claiming it had been secretly activated in Niger during the coup without government approval. He alleged that Starlink terminals were used by Western-aligned NGOs and private contractors to maintain communication networks during the transitional blackout. Chiani stated, "We are not guinea pigs for Silicon Valley's global experiments. If Elon Musk wants to help Africa, he should start by respecting its governments." Starlink has yet to respond officially, but Musk himself cryptically tweeted a day later, "Truth survives." The meaning behind that is anyone's guess, but it certainly added fuel to the fire. Let's zoom out for a second. In less than 2 weeks, 3 West African leaders have stood up and publicly challenged global superpowers, billionaires, and institutions. They're not just asking for respect. They're demanding a rewrite of the rules. And they're doing it from a position of growing popular support within their borders. Meanwhile, global powers are finding themselves in a bind. Push back too hard, and they risk looking like bullies. Stay quiet, and they lose control of key partnerships. It's a lose-lose situation that no one was expecting from countries that were once considered on the margins of global politics. But clearly, the margins are moving. This is no longer about isolated outbursts. What we're witnessing may be the early stages of a coordinated revolution, not through protests or uprisings, but through state-led defiance. The old order, where Western powers made the rules and Africa followed, is being rewritten in real time, and the world is watching. Where this ends is anybody's guess. But one thing is certain: Africa's silence is over. If you're finding this coverage eye-opening, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next major update. The story is still unfolding, and the next headline could change everything. Just days after General Chiani's Starlink allegations and threats of declassifying secret mineral exploitation footage, something unprecedented happened. The African Union was thrown into a full-blown crisis meeting. But here's the twist. It wasn't called by the AU leadership. It was triggered by a coalition of 6 member states led by Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, and Central African Republic, all of whom have experienced either coups or major anti-Western political shifts in the past 3 years. They demanded an emergency session to propose a radical resolution, a call for a complete restructuring of the African Union, with an end to what they described as neo-colonial puppetry and a purge of foreign influence in continental decision-making. Yes, a purge. The document, leaked by a West African diplomat, contained fiery language rarely seen in official AU discourse. It accused the current African Union leadership of being compromised, submissive to Western donors, and unfit to represent the true aspirations of the African people. It demanded that AU leadership be replaced with military and civilian leaders not tied to the IMF, World Bank, or any foreign political patron. This sent shockwaves through Addis Ababa, the AU's headquarters. Officials were reportedly blindsided by the boldness and coordination of the rebel bloc. Diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing a generic press release promising internal review and inclusive dialogue. But the real story was happening behind closed doors and in the streets. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, thousands of civilians poured into public squares waving their national flags and chanting slogans like "Down with the puppets" and "AU for Africans, not Americans." These weren't just protests, they were mass expressions of support for their military-led governments and for the idea that the African Union needs to be liberated from external masters. The Western response? Predictably cautious. The EU and US State Department released nearly identical statements calling for institutional stability and respect for democratic frameworks. But privately, several think tanks and analysts began sounding the alarm. If the AU fractures or if a splinter bloc forms, it could trigger a diplomatic nightmare. Aid programs, military partnerships, and trade agreements, many of which run through AU frameworks, could collapse overnight. And here's where things took an even stranger turn. In a surprise move, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, publicly endorsed the call for an AU overhaul. In a press conference held in Moscow, he said, "The African Union must reflect the voices of all Africans, not just those who serve the interests of former colonizers." That statement lit a fire. Suddenly, Russia positioned itself as the champion of African authenticity, directly challenging decades of Western engagement on the continent. Shortly after, China's state media ran multiple op-eds supporting the idea of an Africa-led AU reform. It was subtle, diplomatic, but the message was clear. China and Russia were backing the insurgent bloc. This is historic. Never before has the African Union faced an internal rebellion that's not based on ideology or elections, but on the foundational question of who really controls the continent's future. Some analysts are now saying that we're watching the early formation of two African spheres. The sovereignty-first bloc, made up of military-led states breaking from the West. The status quo bloc, composed of donor-dependent democracies trying to maintain balance. What happens if this divide becomes official? Will the AU split? Will new institutions rise to replace it, ones backed by Beijing or Moscow? Or will the West double down to keep influence alive? One thing is certain: Africa is not waiting for permission to decide its future anymore. The military leaders once branded as rebels or illegitimate are now setting the agenda, and millions are following them. We are witnessing a continental awakening, one fiery speech and one bold alliance at a time. If you're finding these stories powerful, hit that like button, subscribe for more updates, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Could we be witnessing the death of the old African order and the birth of something new? More is coming. Stay informed. Stay aware. Stay sharp.